Pete, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Welcome.
So to give a brief introduction to myself first, my name is Pete Brink. I'm currently a functional safety engineering leader at KVA by UL, which means I work for Underwriter Laboratories. And KVA is an organization that focuses on specifically assisting other organizations with getting their stuff working in an automotive context safely. I actually started my career working on jet engine control systems in the late 80s, both military and commercial jet engines, and then went on and did a bunch of different things in the embedded space, working on things like in-circuit emulators and satellite modems and cable scanners and things like that. And then I got to Intel, and I stayed at Intel for 18 years. Worked on a lot of different things at Intel. The most notable things were that I led the 2015 Consumer Electronics Show ADAS demo that Intel did, and at the same time was working with an all-volunteer organization to create a software engineering curriculum, but mostly trying to focus on how to build software, how to do things, how to follow the process effectively. From there, I moved to a company, a small startup company focused on creating a software infrastructure to enable autonomous driving. Didn't really work out. So then I moved to a company that was building industrial lasers to the tune of 30 kilowatt lasers. And then, at that point, automotive got back in my blood. And when I saw that KVA had positions open in Portland, I went ahead and jumped at the opportunity. And I've been with KVA now about 18 months. So with that, we have to focus on we have to ask maybe some fundamental questions. So the first of those things is, what is quality? And hang on one second. It's the playback is turned on.
Is something on your side, Pete, or something?
Yeah, it's on my side.
Okay, all right, just checking.
It's not letting me, when I do the playback, it turns on every 30 seconds or whatever. So I don't want to do that. And it is, of course, it's impossible to find how to turn it off. Ah, there it goes. The first of these questions is, what is quality? And you already saw the answer. So quality is meeting or exceeding your customer's expectations. The question is, how do you know that you have quality, and how do you know what your customer's expectations actually are? So the fundamentals of all of those things are the baseline for how we as developers, as software engineers, then ask the question, what is safety? Because if we're going to build something safe, it first has to have quality that's associated with it. And so when we look at ISO 26262, which is the automotive functional safety standard, the first question that it asks, or the first expectation that it has, is that when you're doing this safety development work, that you're going to be working from a quality baseline. But what they don't tell you is what that quality baseline actually is. So part of this presentation then is to go through and make the distinction between what the expectations for quality are, and then what the differentiation is then between that quality expectation and what the safety expectations for development are. And so all of these are going to be sort of play into how Zephyr as an organization and as a development project will need to think about how they do that development in order to be able to qualify the Zephyr for use in automotive. So what is safety? It's establishing or reducing the risk. Why does it keep doing this? I turned off the playback. Anyway.
Apparently it happened again. Sorry, it happened before, Pete. I don't know if you have a version of these slides in PDF
I do.
instead. Okay, then perhaps you could share that.
I will do that instead. I have to find it first. 1 second.
Sure. No worries. Okay, this is looking good now.
Yep. So when we think about quality versus safety, however, they can sometimes be at odds with one another, because if when we're talking about having a car that doesn't start is very safe. It's minimal risk that's associated with using a car that doesn't actually go anywhere or doesn't go very fast. But that doesn't really meet the quality expectations. So there are expectations on the part of the driver that the car is going to start, that we're going to be able to get it somewhere, and that um, it's going to be usable in that context. So what we have to do is come up with a methodology where we think about how this will both fulfill what the driver's expectations are and do it safely. So when we look at the IEEE Computer Society's software engineering competency model, um, it defines a series of different skills as cross-cutting skill areas that sort of span the breadth of what we consider software engineering. And actually security is one of those as well. So all of those represent then different development process models for how we think about if we're going to do this in a quality context, if we're going to do this in a safety or security context. So specifically, both of those derive from this rigorous development process. So there are expectations that whatever you're going to do, you're going to follow this process, a defined rigorous development process. Um, so it's important to understand specifically when we talk about software that a lot of people think of software engineering in particular as a branch of computer science. But when you really think of it as when we're developing an embedded system, it's actually a branch of systems engineering, because the system level functionality in a car is almost invariably these days expressed through software. So we as software engineers have to actually think like systems engineers in order to get that overall functionality of the vehicle to be where we want it to be, so that the functionality that's exposed to the driver or to the autonomy system works the way we expect it to. And so one of the some of the important takeaways are that software doesn't fail. So from a safety context, software always does what you tell it to do. So when we talk about how we as software engineers need to work, we need to understand that any problem that exists within the software inherently is a system design problem. And so it forces us to think in a very different way. It forces us to think from the outside in. And because we have to recognize that if there is a problem, that it's going to force us to make potentially a design change in order to fix the operation of the system that we're working on. And that process then specifically defines how how the properties of the system are actually produced. And so at least so when we talk about that it doesn't fail, it means that software isn't subject to random hardware failures so if you have bit flips or other things, or potential surges or voltage errors or other things like that, software isn't, we don't consider those as part of how we look at software failing. So certainly we can put software in there to handle those things, but those are specific things that we're putting in place in order to handle the hardware failures. So when we think about ISO 26262, which is the automotive safety standard, and this expectation that we're going to be working from this quality baseline, when we look at the development model that ISO 26262 defines, specifically in Part 6, which is what we look at for software, it follows this model. It follows what we might expect a typical waterfall development process model to be. We start with requirements, we do architectural design, unit design and implementation, verification, and then actually all the testing phases. So unit verification, integration and verification, and then finally the testing of the embedded software. And in each of those testing phases is really designed for proving that some portion of the design phases, which are clauses 6, 7, 8, that those things were done correctly. I will stress at this point that though it looks like a waterfall development process model, it does not mean that you can't do iterative development. It just means that if you are going to do iterative development, you have to demonstrate how your iterative development process model satisfies each of the different phases that are described here. And last but not least is clause 5, which is where they want you to go through in detail all of the information about what your development process, the product development looks like. So they want to see what the environment is, what coding, what tools you're using, what coding standard you're using, and so on and so forth. A lot of that information. They expect that information to be detailed because it's one of the development methodologies that we use to reduce the number of bugs that get introduced into the code. This is taken directly from the specification. And yeah, okay. I had a highlight in here because of what I wanted to highlight is that on the left-hand side of the V, once we finished with the system level, we have the requirements, architecture, and the design, unit design, and these are the design phases that are expected. And when we move from one of these to the next, there are quality verification expectations for each one of these. So when we finish with the requirements, we're going to do a quality review of those requirements. When we do the architectural design, we're going to do a quality and safety review of the architectural design. And we do each one of those before we move to the next phase. And then each one of these then is a specific test. So we do verification by analysis on this side and verification by test on the right-hand side of the V. Wanted to make sure that was clear to everyone. So when we talk about these things, before we begin with the development processes, the development process itself, there's some prerequisites that are expected. In part 2, which is the management, the functional safety management, in clause 5, it lists out a specific expectation that you are going to develop this in accordance with a safety standard. So when we talk about qualification of Zephyr for automotive, that means that there's this expectation that you're going to be doing this in compliance with a quality management system. And there are examples here like IATF 16949 in conjunction with ISO 9001. Most people think of ISO 9001 as a manufacturing standard, but there is actually a portion of it that is directly applicable to software, not that it ever gets followed necessarily. And then there are other development process models like the capability maturity model integration or automotive software performance improvement capability determination. That's what ASPICE actually stands for. And these basically describe a development process model, not just for the development itself, but also for the organization, because these two include a process improvement for the organization as part of the whole thing. And then in clause 5, this is what I talked about already, is the documentation of that quality management system compliant software development lifecycle. So they want to see that you have an existing software development lifecycle that spans all of this, and then how you are going to tailor that modification, tailor that according to how you're doing your development. So if you're using an agile development process, they want to see that you have, as part of that agile development, that you have the quality reviews for the requirements, architecture, and design, as well as all the testing that's part of the agile development process. So in part 6, then, jumping back to the software portion of the whole thing, in the clause 5 of part 6, we now want to see the safety-related documentation for clause 5. And this is talking about what the coding guidelines. I don't know if people out there have heard MISRA, but MISRA is a development standard. It's a coding standard that's from the Motor Industry Software Reliability Association and ends up being the de facto standard for code development across the automotive industry. It's from an organization in England, in the UK, but it ends up getting used in the US, Japan, and Germany, and I believe Korea also. Specifically, there are versions for both C and C++. They also want the details about how you are doing your branching and merging techniques. So Git has become fairly commonplace throughout the automotive industry. So using something like a standard Git flow is going to work just fine. It's just a matter of getting that documented and what the specific process is for how you manage your branches and how those branches get reviewed before they are incorporated into the main release branch of the code that you're doing the development on. And then the sort of generic general development process in and of itself, because I know that those two often end up being closely entwined with one another. So so now we'll talk about quality versus safety in the design phases of the development process. In the requirements phase, when we want to go through and do the quality reviews of the requirements, so we have these safety requirements and we have to do a quality review of those requirements. So first off, they have to be written in a natural language. They need to be informal or semi-formal. Semi-formal just means you use some additional diagrammatic support for the requirements themselves. They have to be uniquely identified, and they have to have a status, which can mean, you know, um, new, in progress, complete, and so on and so forth. They have to be for the safety requirements. So these requirements attributes apply to all of the requirements, whether it's for the nominal functionality or for the safety functionality that's been added on. But the additional stuff for the safety attributes are they have to be uniquely identifiable as a safety requirement. They have to have a safety level that's associated with them because there's a certain amount of rigor that's associated during the rest of the development process for this if they are a safety requirement. And they have to be allocated to a specific ECU, so a specific set of functionality that exists in the automobile itself. And that can be to the braking system, to the steering system, to the infotainment system. There are 100 different ECUs, electronic control units, on modern vehicles these days. When we do the quality review, now, so I highlighted some of these just to sort of call them out, but really they all have to be accounted for. So these are the types of characteristics that we want to review those requirements to. And we want to be able to know that when we've created a requirement that it can't be misinterpreted, that somebody who's not an expert can understand what the requirement actually says, that the requirement is a singular thing, that doesn't lump a bunch of multiple different things into the requirement itself. And because that happens, you can't write a test if your requirement is not atomic. That it is, in fact, verifiable, that this is something that you could write a test for, or you can analyze and prove that it actually works, and that you don't have any specific implementation detail in the requirement itself. Because the premise is we're developing this system from the outside in. We don't want to specify what the implementation detail is yet, because it may be that the requirements demand a higher power processor, or there may be some explicit capabilities of a given operating system or programming language that we need. So what we need is to avoid specifying what that is up front. And then as a whole, when we have the completed requirements, we want to see that they are complete. They describe the functionality and the safety completely, and that they are traceable back to whatever whatever they were created for in the first place. So the traceability is a big one when we talk about both quality and safety. So that when we write tests, we want to be able to write a test and demonstrate that that test is for this requirement. And when we create an architecture or we write some code, we're writing that code or creating that component within the architecture to satisfy a specific requirement that's been created. So when we talk about architecture, the architecture then, it has to be traceable back to the requirements, of course, that's what I was just talking about. But it also has to demonstrate, we also have to be able to demonstrate that the architecture satisfies what the requirements were actually specifying in the first place. So And specifically in the context of ISO 26262, the first part of the requirements, they only talk about the safety requirements because there's this expectation that you're only going to be doing that this is the safety specification. But when we talk about architecture, it doesn't make any sense to try and describe only the safety portions of the architecture outside the context of what the overall architecture actually is. They have to be described the architecture has to be described in its entirety. So you have to have the nominal as well as the safety functionality there together and demonstrate how they interact with one another. We want to see, as part of this, we want to go through some kind of decomposition process to demonstrate what the components are that are going to be in the system that we're developing. We want to see how they interact with one another, what type of process sequences, how they exchange information, and whether or not the interfaces that we've defined allow them to do that information exchange. And if there are any specific timing constraints that are associated with it, that those are detailed as part of this as well. You'll note that we haven't even considered anything about what code we're going to write yet. The goal of all of this is to try and get rid of bugs and define really well what the system is that we're building prior to writing any code. Some of the architectural characteristics, a lot of these you're going to see that they look very simple, very similar to the types of characteristics that were there during the requirements phase. But we start bringing in some more concepts from things like object-oriented design. So we want to see that the components themselves are well encapsulated, that we have modularity, that they are essentially, we do a design by contract here in that these components don't introspect into each other's data. So encapsulation holds, and specifically, we have the modularity requirement is really a maintainability requirement, such that if there is a change necessary, we can make a modification to a specific component, and it doesn't affect anything else in the system, as long as the component we change adheres to the interfaces that were specified during the architectural design phase. So once we've documented that architectural design, they also want to get some idea of what the upper level, the level of system resources that are going to be necessary. This is difficult to do, and sometimes it's just a crapshoot. We don't actually know what it is, what the actual necessity is, but they want some representation of what the CPU percentage, the amount of RAM and ROM, and potentially the amount of communication bandwidth. So if you're using Ethernet or CAN or LIN in an automotive context, we want to be able to know and understand the bandwidth expectations that are going to be used. So if you're talking to a camera, for instance, or a LiDAR sensor, sometimes those can end up using a lot of data. And the main thing, so understand all of the things that we just talked about from an architectural perspective are really quality criteria. When we reach this point, the architecture, then there are two specific things that we're going to do to the architecture itself to distinguish this from solely a quality evaluation. And those two things are a software FMEA, failure modes and effects analysis, which we basically give a report. And this is looking at the interfaces between components and saying, okay, what happens if one of these screws up, and will this interface continue to work? And then the dependent failure analysis, which is basically saying, can any of the non-safety critical code interfere with the safety critical code? Because what we want to be able to do is demonstrate that the safety critical code can always run. After the architecture is complete, now we need to go through and give the detail about what happens inside each one of the components that we specified during the architectural phase. So we're going to define the functional behavior of each of those software components. If there is a further decomposition that you need to do, then the internal interfaces between those, but inside the component itself, and the documentation related to any of the safety mechanisms that are there to provide either diagnostic coverage for a potential hardware fault or a specific safety mechanism that's sort of monitoring an existing system itself. Obviously, the unit implementation, it needs to be traceable to the architecture, which is then traceable back to the requirements, and the unit design quality. These you'll see, it's the same set of criteria. Well, it's a reduced set, really. But these then specifically talk about this from a unit perspective. So the individual component, how is it implemented? Is it comprehensible? Is it consistent with the interfaces that we specified during the architectural phase? Is it verifiable and maintainable? So from there, then, once we've got the unit design complete, now it's time for implementation. Now we're actually going to start writing code. And with the understanding, I'm not saying that you can't write code beforehand, because certainly a certain amount of prototyping is inevitably necessary in order for us to know or to be able to derive what some of the architecture and requirements and design need to be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the code that you're going to be writing for the safety critical cases that you're putting in place. So ISO 26262 goes through and lists out all of these quality criteria for the code itself. So the code itself has to have the correct order of execution. It has to be consistent. It has to have correct control and data flow and the rest of these things. But specifically, these all then also have to be traceable back to the unit design, architecture, and the requirements. If we're going to be writing code, we want to know what we're writing that code for, and we want to have these criteria as limiting factors in terms of how we're going to do this and creating functions that are specifically testable. So there, from the safety perspective, we have the additional limitations. So I know that there's a lot of people who they want to write the code that says, if this return, and then write the rest of the function. So that's something that's not allowed in this context. What we want to see in this context is you say if this condition, and then you have your open and close brace, and you do the entire function in there. And if that condition has failed, it drops out naturally, as opposed to having a return statement at the beginning of the function. They don't want to see any dynamic memory allocation. They want to see that if you create a variable, it's always initialized. They want you to avoid global variables. That's always been in there. Maybe that's just a quality criterion. And they want you to avoid implicit type conversion because C and C++ will change types for you without telling you. So if you do a change, if you do end up changing types, they want you to make it explicit. They want you to cast it deliberately from either an 8-bit or a 16-bit to a 32-bit value and make it very explicit that you're doing that. Once we've finished with the implementation, and understanding that the first phase of the implementation, the first phase of the testing is really sort of integral with the implementation. And so that's the unit testing, which is where what we are doing now is we're taking each of the functions and treating it as a black box and exercising that function via its exposed prototype. And what we want to do is then go through and measure and try to determine what the complexity of that function is and minimize that design complexity and basically demonstrate that we can cover that we can provide the requisite code coverage. So this means going through and making sure that depending on which ASIL, which safety level you're targeting, we can just cover all the statements or cover all of the branches or cover all of the conditions in all of the branches and have sufficient number of tests to demonstrate that this code has been entirely exercised. And that means that you're doing the appropriate parameter checking and returning the correct values as well. And if that sounds laborious, it is. This is one of my first jobs was doing this, and it's quite tedious. But when we talk about the criticality of some of these things, so if we're working with an autonomous vehicle or in an aircraft, and there is a code bug in there, we want to have found it and make sure that that thing doesn't happen. So the quality metrics, we're going to go through and do the static analysis. So this is a typical static analysis tool that you're going to run it perhaps as part of your CI system. You're going to have documentation about what your test environment is, if it's, Google test or WinTest, or if you're using Behave or something like that. The tests themselves, because the code we've written should be traceable to a requirement, then what we want to be able to do is demonstrate that that we have full coverage of the requirements at the testing level. This is the stuff I talked about with the addition of the code coverage metrics for unit testing in a safety context. Depending on which ASIL level, we're going to do statement branch or a thing called MCDC, modified condition decision coverage, which basically shows wants you to do all of these things for each function. This is only if you're targeting the most safety critical stuff that you have to do MCDC. The next step after we've gone through and we've done the testing, the unit testing for all of those different functions, now we want to join those functions together and basically demonstrate that the components themselves, the components that were specified during the architectural phase, that we can exercise that when we bring those functions together, the components fulfill all of the requirements that were allocated to them. So we want to see that we fulfill all the requirements, that there isn't any additional functionality, there's no undesired functionality in there, that we have sufficient resources. Remember when we talked about coming up with what the CPU percentage, the RAM, ROM, and communication bandwidth, we want to now demonstrate what we are actually using and how effective the safety measures actually are. So when we did that safety analysis on the architecture, now's the point where we're going to try to do fault injection and say, okay, if we create this type of error, does it do the right thing? The additional metrics for integration testing, we want to now see that the function coverage. So when we're exercising this component, are we covering how much of the code within that component are we actually covering? And um, this is the number of functions internal to the component itself, and this is the exposed interface from that component. How well have we exercised that? And then the last thing that we do is the embedded software testing. This is where we are taking the system as a whole, and we are now trying to create what amounts to a requirements traceability matrix. So we take this unit and we either test it on the bench or we test it on a vehicle, and we demonstrate that it works in all of the situations where it is expected to. And the report then that we create, so a lot of this is about creating the requisite documentation to demonstrate that we've done the due diligence at each and every step along the way. We want to show requirements coverage, the status of the software, so it's complete, and if all defects found and dispositioned. So it's obviously we're not going to get through this without having some bugs, but certainly we don't want have any highs or criticals in there. The last piece of all of this is the embedded software for the safety testing, is to make sure that we have requirements-based testing, and that we do at the vehicle level, that we create the kind of faults or failures that the software is expected to see and demonstrate that the safety mechanisms work the way that they are expected to. And that can be something as simple as shining a light on the dashboard. It's a thing called a telltale to let the driver know to check the engine, or that is a problem in one of their safety mechanisms that's on the vehicle today. And that is it. I know I went a little bit over, but I hope that we have opportunities now to talk about to questions about what the process actually is, and how the Zephyr as a community can go through and start adapting to some of the requirements that are necessary for the highly safety critical environment. Carlos, are there any questions out there? In the chat, perhaps? Okay, well, I mean, if there are no questions, I can certainly hang around for a while if people are interested in asking these things later on. But I'm interested in finding out more about what people are doing and how the Zephyr community can interact with the safety community effectively in order to start moving along the path towards being able to qualify for automotive in an automotive context. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay,
Okay,
I will stop recording now here then, if there are no more questions. Thank you very much.
appreciate it. Do you have
Thank
any
you.
questions?
Not immediately. No, I do. I actually was wondering about one particular one, which is actually, yeah. Now that you ask me, yes, I do. Is the architecture? When you were talking about the architecture back in the yeah, and about how it was the architectural design. Yeah, how is that actually captured?
So have you done architecture before? So
Well,
like component
I have
diagrams?
never in the context of safety. So always in the context of internal product design without the safety requirements, or without the
Okay.
requirement to comply with something.
Okay, so it works very much the same way. So what we're going to
Okay.
go through and is go through and do a functional or volatility-based decomposition and allocate functionality to different specific components or building blocks within the architecture itself. With the understanding that um, there is those architectural analyses that you're going to do. So the software FMEA, what happens is when we have two different components, we look at the information that they're going to exchange, and we use, if people probably aren't familiar, but there are some guide words that we can use when we're asking questions about that information or that data exchange. So like in a communications protocol or a communications example, so let's say we
Mm-hmm.
have two components, they're exchanging information over a CAN bus. So the guide word is too early. And so what we say is, what happens if the packet that we're sending between these two components arrives too early? So essentially before the receiver is ready to receive that information.
Right.
What happens? Does it get queued up, or does it simply get missed? And by the same token, there's a too late. So in that instance, um, we had a window on the receiver side where we were looking for data, and it didn't arrive in that window. So and it arrived too late. What happens in that situation? And so there's a series of, we use these guide words to say too high, too low, too early, too late, so on and so forth, in terms of how we evaluate how these components are going to interact with one another. And then that gives us it gives us coverage, it gives us knowledge with regards to what kind of safety mechanisms we might need to put in place in order to provide protection, or it gives us guidance. And most of the time we have to write new safety requirements to say, okay, yes, we need what's called end-to-end protection. It's a typical communication protocol if we're doing something over Ethernet or CAN, where you have a sequence number, you have a message ID, a source and destination ID, and so on and so forth, such that the receiver can can receive it in the correct window. And it then also has to have a timer that's checking to see if it didn't receive something in time, it's going to time out and get to a safe state and say, okay, I lost communication. We need to do something in order to correct this problem or handle this problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can mitigate it completely, but you can as a component within this do something to cause the system to function now in a degraded mode, for instance. That makes sense, Terry? Does that make sense?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, it does a
Yeah.
lot.
Okay, good.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and and that sort of goes with my early statement about how you really need to focus from the outside in. We can't focus on what the implementation is until we have some sense of what it is that we're trying to solve.
Okay. We have a couple more questions. Can we reach you later with questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Your contact info was in the slides, I understand.
I don't know that I put it in there, but you can either send pete.brink@gmail.com or peter.brink@ul.com.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. And then one more, it's a question. Is the unit test, are unit tests in general needed for the target certificating, for all the target certificating components? I'm reading it as it comes from the chat.
So I didn't see that in the chat. Let me take a look.
It's the last one in the chat.
For all target certificating component. So yes, there's an expectation that, and this is actually why you are encouraged to keep your functions small and relatively. There's a bunch of criteria that we can use when we talk about design complexity. The first of those is a thing called cyclomatic complexity. And you want to keep your cyclomatic complexity to probably 10 or less, because the minute you start getting above that, upwards, if 15 or higher, the code becomes so branchy that it becomes very, very difficult to unit test effectively. You might need 15 different tests in order to demonstrate all of the different branches that you have in the code. So you're encouraged to keep your functions small and simple and not very branchy. And included with that too is like nesting depth. You don't want your nesting depth to go any deeper than about 4. And ideally, if you can get away with it, 1 or 2 nesting deep. Not always possible. So, I mean, like I said, you're encouraged. What are some of the other ones? Limit the number of parameters on a function, because there are 2 sources for this. Robert Martin, who wrote the book Clean Code, says you probably don't want to have any more. He says the absolute limit on the number of parameters to a function is 3. But Steve McConnell, who wrote Code Complete, says you can have up to 4 parameters on a function. So really, we want to focus on trying to keep these functions as small and concise as possible. And because obviously the more number of parameters on there, the more parameter checking that you have to potentially do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different mindset.
Sure. We have a couple more questions. I'm going to try to. Are you planning to perform MC/DC coverage, which is highly recommended for high ASILs? I don't know if you mean Zephyr in general, or I assume this is in the context of Zephyr. So I don't know if you know that, Pete.
Yes.
Great.
So yes, I'm actually going to read it. Sorry if you talked about this, I missed it.
It's the previous one. Sorry, Pete. Are you planning to perform MC/DC coverage, which is highly recommended for high ASILs?
So I am not personally planning on doing it. The thing that I do. I've been consulting with Kate Stewart, and in terms of how we establish the processes in order to be able to get Zephyr to um, a state where it could be automotive qualified. It could be compliant with the automotive specification. And the thing that I notice specifically for software that is being developed for safety critical applications is what they do is they develop it to ASIL D.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they develop it to ASIL D, it means they can go into any environment. If you develop it to ASIL B, you might be limited. You're limited in terms of where you can use it. So if they develop it to ASIL D, then you can use that software anywhere, as long as you provide the requisite documentation and requirements and everything else that goes with it. So when we think of Zephyr, I recommend thinking of it as what we call a safety element out of context, which basically you develop it with a bunch of assumptions about how it's going to be used. and then produce all of that documentation, including those assumptions. And so if somebody adopts it, then they validate those assumptions or will work for them and simply use the documentation that you provided as part of their safety argumentation. So with Leonidas, did that answer your question?
Great.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we have another one from Silvan. If you want to read it, Pete, yourself.
Yes, I'm okay. So let's see. I will skip the excuse. In Zephyr introduction presentation, the audit and safety goals of Zephyr were mentioned. Are these mainly regarding implementing and documenting the development processes in Zephyr in accordance with ISO 26262, or are those goals another topic? So I'm going to say they are probably what I would consider a subset. So we have to document the development processes as well as the development environment, and then document all of the different stages, the different architecture, the different stages throughout the software development lifecycle. So both of those, all of them are important because all of this was determined empirically, like some of the stuff I listed about the number of parameters and the nesting depth and other things like that. A lot of those were determined empirically in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. So that knowledge has been around a long, long time, but it's really only been applicable in the safety critical environments where it really makes a fundamental difference how you do this. So as we see a lot of open source and high technology try to now move into the safety critical spaces, they now need to understand why and what the purpose of these development methodologies actually are, why they are there, and what they actually prevent. So yes, I think so. Sorry, what was it, Sylvan? Yeah, Sylvan, did that answer your question? Okay, good. Thank you. Looks
We
like
have
there's
one more.
another one.
Yeah, exactly. From Mina.
Yes. From the internet, yes. There is MISRA C 2008 and 2020. So the 2021, I'm not sure that it's out yet, to be honest with you. I have issues with using C++ in safety critical environments. I actually don't recommend using anything beyond C++ 14. A lot of the newer features within C++, I'm concerned with using because there's a certain amount of ambiguity in terms of how the compiler is going to implement it, how it's going to render that into actual code. I prefer more determinism. So that being said, the MISRA C 2008 doesn't really do it, doesn't cut it if you're going to use C++ 14. So there's another standard. It's called AUTOSAR, AUTOSAR C++ 14. And that's the one I would recommend using if you want to use a relatively modern feature, some of the relatively more modern features of C++.
This one we missed before, so sorry, Cosmetis. We missed this one, which is asking about the tool. So what type of tools we plan to support and whether those tools will be open source or not.
So I'm glad you brought that up. There is in ISO 262 and actually most safety critical, what do we call them, specifications. I've worked with quite a few. I've worked with some industrial ones like IEC 61508 and ISO 13849. I've worked with the avionics ones, DO 178C and DO 254, and they all have a tool qualification metric that's associated with it, software tools. So what I will say is, what you need to do when you consider what tools you're going to use is that you have to either have sufficient processes in place to determine whether or not that tool has introduced a fault into your safety critical application, or you have to use qualified tools, one of the two.
So it is possible not to use qualified tools.
Absolutely.
Then. Okay.
So the qualification method that you use basically means it depends on how onerous the qualification, the additional processes that you're going to implement actually are. It's definitely possible. And in fact, QNX, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but QNX uses a version of GCC that they adopted called QCC, that they use as their compiler. And they have a suite of something on the order of, I don't remember how many. The last I saw was like 24,000 tests that they run on the compiler, and they've actually found bugs in GCC and passed fixes back to the GCC community, and they then produce a qualified compiler, so you can use it for your safety critical development. But if you're not going to use a safety critical compiler, you're going to purchase one from Tasking or Green Hills or somebody like that. Um, then you have to add those additional processes in place, because it's not really possible for an individual organization. So if the Linux community wants to adopt, or the GCC community wants to adopt and take on the task of qualifying the compiler, that's great. But I don't really see that it's in their best interest right now.
What about Zephyr? Do you know which tools we're trying to? I know that there's been we have some of our own, right? And there are already checks that are ongoing on CI right now. I know that we use Coverity. I know that there's been talk about other vendors, but do you have more details?
So Coverity is it's a static analysis, right?
Yeah, but it does have it does come with a set of rules, I think, that if I'm not mistaken, that can be used to verify some of the coding guidelines. So
Okay, right, but that's static analysis. That's the static analysis of the code itself.
yes.
So the question then we have to ask is about the operation of the tool that you're creating. So
Mm-hmm.
first we ask the question, is it possible for this tool to affect the code, the binary that we are producing for our target environment?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it possible that it could corrupt our requirements or architectural design? Or, I mean, really, it's the set of tools that we're going to use to generate any of the work products that are associated with the safety development that we're doing.
Okay.
And that's part of why we have those verification measures throughout the development lifecycle, because when we do that quality review of the requirements, that can be one of the mechanisms that we say, oh, our tool screwed up, we discovered a bug, we have this process in place in order to basically detect and prevent that tool from interfering or creating an error in our production stream, in our development lifecycle.
Understood.
Okay.
Very good.
Any other questions? Yes. So yes, so it's there in the chat, the AutoSAR C++ 2014.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one that I would use. And all of Misra you have to purchase. I don't think you have to purchase AutoSAR. I think you can just download it.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. I think we'll end it here. Thank you very much, Pete, for the excellent presentation. And I'll see you all in the next talks. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great
Bye.
day.
Bye, you too.
Bye.